because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Mga kapatid, dalhin ko kayo sa isang scholar of particular New Testament. Siya si Bart Ehrman, isa siyang Doctor of Philosophy, mayroon siyang Master of Divinity, an expert in textual Bible criticism and history, and the early Christian history also, Jesus Christ, the history of Jesus Christ, and the early Christians' life. Ito ang expertise niya po. Siya ay nakapagsulat at nakapagbasa ng Greek. Ito si Dr. Ehrman. In short, he is the living Bible scholar of the New Testament. Palagi siyang may debate, at ang katawa-tawa pa nito, katakataka at katawa-tawa. Na instead, the more deeper siya nag-study of the New Testament, he become ngayon agnostic. Wala na, hindi siya naniniwala. Ini-reject na niya ang New Testament. At ngayon, nakipagdebate siya sa mga taong nag-aangkin na ang Biblia, ang particular New Testament, ito ay salita ng Diyos. Para maniwala kayo mga kapatid, hindi ko lang hahabaan ito. Kung kayo po ay may pagdududa sa kanyang background, sino siya, pwede niyo i-research. Research. Mayroon naman diyang pangalan, nakita ninyo, Bart Ehrman, i-research niyo kung sino siya. Para makita niyo ang background, authenticity, magsikap tayo mga kapatid para hindi tayo manantili na ignoramos tayo kung ano talaga ang New Testament. Ngayon pakinggan natin siya.
But that they were written by 2 eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by 2 people who were close companions to people who were eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. Intense research has a way of changing your mind about things. But I don't want you to think that this is a reason for you not to use your brain. Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Craig and I will agree on this.
Bakit ba siya nagsabing use your brain? Dahil, alam niya, dahil siyang Kristiyano dati siyang fanatic. Dati siyang naniniwala nga ang New Testament talaga without any doubt ay talagang salita ng Diyos. So sa karamihan po ngayon nakikinig sa akin, marami pong Christian na fanatiko po. Kung ano lang nasulat diyan sa New Testament, sa Biblia, yun na ang paniniwalaan. Without any criticism, without any studying, totoo yun. Ang Diyos pinatay, totoo yun. Kasi nasulat Pag nasulat na, wala nang question. Ang ibig sabihin na fanatic na ba? Hindi na naggamit. Ano bang nakikinig na lang? Nakikinig na lang. Hindi na ginagamit ang utak. Hindi na ginagamit ang mata. Parang robot na ba? Karamihan ng mga Christian ganun. Parang robot na lang. Sabi, oo na. Hindi na ginagamit sariling mata pagbasa at sariling tainga pagdinig at sariling utak hindi na ginagamit. Sarado na lahat kung anong nasulat sa New Testament. Ganun. Karamihan ngayon, ganun mga tao. Wala na kini-question, sino kaya nagsulat nito? Saan ka isinulat? Kailan isinulat? Bakit ito sinulat? Wala na yan. Wala na lang sa kanilang tainga. Basta nasulat, yun na. Kung sabi ni, kakainin niyo ang bato. Kainin yung bato, kakainin nila yan. Pasampal ang kanan, ipasampal talaga nila yan. Mayroon silang sarili. So hindi na nila i-review kung ano ang nasulat. So that's why sabi niya dito isang scholar,
God gave you a brain to think with. Apply reason. That's why God made you a human being instead of a slug. Don't be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it. Not run from it.
Huwag kayo magdepende kung anong tinuturo. Kung ang katotohanan salungat sa inyong tinuturo, inyong natatanggap na tinuturo sa inyo, kung ang katotohanan ay salungat sa inyong natatanggap, naririnig, ay sundin niyo ang katotohanan. Wag lang na dahil ito ang tinuturo sa amin, ito ang tinuturo sa pare, ito ang tinuturo ni pastor, kinagisnan ko ito, yun ang paniniwalaan natin. Sabi niya, hindi. Pag ikaw ay talaga gumagamit sa iyong utak, kung ano ang katotohanan, yun sundin mo ang anong totoo, katotohanan. Huwag mong sundin kung anong narinig mo lang, nahagilap mo nga may sariling niluluto na ng pastor. Gamitin niyo yung brain dahil may sarili kayong utak, may sarili kayong mata. Ha? Huwag mong isipin na sa paningin nyo ay puti dahil sinabi ng pastor pula, ay talagang maniwala kayo na pula. Dahil sinasabi ni pastor pula, kahit nakita nyo ay puti.
I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it. I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't.
Sa kanyang pag-aaral, sabi niya, hindi ako naniniwala nga ang New Testament sinulat sa mga eyewitnesses, meaning kasama ni Kristo. Hindi siya naniwala nga ito ay sinulat mismo sa mga kasamahan ni
To be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point,
yung nasulat diyan nga according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, wala ito in the first century, wala ito sa first century. Doon na ito isinulat doon sa about the last second century. In the early first century to the middle second century, wala pa itong nasulat ito na yung according to, wala pa yan. Walang identification. Doon na yan nasulat. Ang kanilang research is Irenaeus pa ang nagsulat niyan eh. Nagpatong diyan Matthew, basahin. Kay Mateo to lalagyan according to Matthew. Basa naman. Iniisip Marcos ito kay Marcos. Basa naman. Lucas ito, lang ni Lucas. Sila mismo ang mga tao almost 200 years sila ang naglagay doon, nagpatong niyan sa pangalan. Walang alam ang mga kasama ni Kristo, matagal na silang namatay. Ayun sa kanyang I'm only elaborating kung ano sa kanyang sinasabi, mga kapatid.
None of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels, as they've come down to us, is that they were anonymous and we don't know their names.
Mga kapatid, paniniwalaan natin. Itong ito ay Doctor of Philosophy, Master of Divinity, expert and Bible scholar of the New Testament. He can read and can write Greek. Itong tao na ito. At dating religious professor, teacher ito. At ilang libro na sulat, 30 books na sinulat niya. At mayroon siyang 6 na libro na best-selling according to the news in America, the best-selling ang libro niya na published in America. Sinong mas matindi sa inyo? Ikaw, pastor? Ikaw, layman? Ikaw, pare? Ano bang specialize mo? Ito ay specialize ito on textual criticism of the New Testament, and he studied historical Jesus and the early life of the Christianity. Itong tao na ito. Sinong mas authority? Sinong mas may laking kaalaman?
Built on eyewitness testimony. But the important point that I want to make is that even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need law courts. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask
Ipalagay
somebody.
lang natin, ipalagay lang natin, kahit sila pa ang nagsulat, kahit sila pa ang eyewitnesses, sapat na po ba? Kasi kung sapat na po ang eyewitnesses, yung nakakita, yung nag-report, bakit pa tayo mga korte dito sa Amerika? Mayroon pa tayong korte. Ang mga eyewitnesses, hindi enough. Kundi mayroong korte, dahil sa korte, gigisahin sila sa mga taon, babalis ka din, baliin yung mga circumstansya para lalabas ang katotohanan. Bakit pa may korte? Kung ganun lang pala, eyewitnesses lang kung anong sinasabi, ay wala na tayong korte. Kung ganun, bakit para mayroon ba tayong law court sa ating mga kaso dito? Padaan pa ng litigation, investigation. Bakit mayroon tayong korte nga ganun? Kung palaga basihan lang natin ang nagsulat, kung sino ang nagsabi, sino ang nakakita, basihan natin, then judgment kaagad. Ay hindi pwede. May nag-marites sa'yo, tama na ito. Tapos kaagad judgment. Yan ba ang korte? Hindi. Ano ang purpose sa korte? Kukunin lahat ng mga ebidensya and proof, left and right, black and white, kukunin lahat. Prosecution and the accused, ipaharap. Ay dito, ayaw na nila eh. Pag may nagmarites, yun na nga. So, tingnan ninyo. Ito ay, hindi ito Muslim nagsabi. Ito ay dating Christian expert of the New Testament.
Eyewitnesses do not always get all the information right. But even if they did, it wouldn't matter because the Gospels of the New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. And in fact, they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died.
And the so-called writings, nakita, ito ay nasulat 40, 50 years. 4 decades, 5 decades ito sinulat. Pagkatapos nga wala na si Kristo. Paano natin ito mapapaniwalaan? So yun ang sinasabi niya.
He wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language.
Anong sinasabi niya? Si Kristo ay Aramaic. Yung mga disciple nila nagsasalita ng Aramaic, nagsulat ng Aramaic. Whereas itong New Testament, sinulat ito sa ibang lingwahe sa different nation. Hindi doon sa Jerusalem sinulat, hindi sa lugar nila, kundi ito nasulat sa Greek. Naman talaga, all the scholars today believe na they accepted na the early manuscript is sinulat sa Greek. Paano na Greek? Ang mga followers ni Jesus Christ is Aramaic. Nako, example, ako, Cebuano ako. Ang mga kasamahan ko, mga Cebuano. Ang lahat naming sinulat ay Ilocano. Wala na kami, namatay na kami, mga Cebuano, mga kasamahan ko, nagsulat kami. Ngayon, mga kaibigan ko, mga alipures ko, mga Cebuano, may sinulat kami. Ngayon, namatay na ako. Yung libro nakita nyo, Ilocano lahat, nagsulat. The same. Si Kristo, yung mga disipulo niya ay mga Aramaic speaking, they are speaking Aramaic. Jesus Christ, the teacher, is speaking Aramaic. Why ang writings is Greek? Sinulat ito, wala na. Kahit mismo yung nagsulat, hindi sila nag-claim. Yung mismo, ang Mateo, Marcos, Lucas, Juan, hindi sila nag-claim na sila ang disipulo raw. Wala diyang mabasa nga kami ang mga disipulo ni Kristo. Wala ka nang mabasa diyan.
Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.
So, bahala na kayo mga kapatid. Ginawa ko na ang lahat. Ha? May nagsasalita na isang scholar of the New Testament, doctor of philosophy, master of divinity, isang professor, isang writer, isang editor. Kilala ito today. He is the living scholar of the New Testament today nga nagpapatunay na ang New Testament hindi sinulat sa mga apostolis ni Kristo. At walang mga pangalan at anonymous nang ibig sabihin hindi kilala ang nagsulat. Tapos yung ang yung batayan sa iyong kaligtasan, sabi nga ni Kristo, di ba? Ang dapat ang bahay ay napatayo mo sa bato, hindi sa buhangin. Dahil kung napatayo sa buhangin, pagdating sa alon ay magigiba. Yun din ang paniniwala. Kung ang paniniwala niyo ay rooted from the anonymous books, how can you assure this is the true teaching of Jesus Christ? So maraming salamat po sa inyong panonood. Please share mga kapatid. Subscribe sa aking YouTube at please follow in my Facebook. Salamat po helping of this da'wah and Allah inshallah will give you the same reward. Subhanakallah Allahumma bihamdika asyhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.